So yeah, thanks for joining us. I think you're in the most important session of this whole ETH Denver, in my personal opinion. My name is Josh Swihart, by the way. I'm the Senior Vice President of Growth, Policy, and Regulatory Relations for the Electric Coin Company. We built and support something called Zcash. If you haven't heard of Zcash, it was the first implementation of ZK on a blockchain. It actually may be the first implementation of it in software before anybody knew how to spell ZK. So that's my little humble brag. But we have an amazing panel of builders that are experts. And if you're a builder, I'm glad you're here. And maybe there'll be some good insights from these experts on how to think about privacy as you're building your products. So we'll just start here with you, Sara, and maybe if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Sara Drakeley. I'm the CTO at MobileCoin.
Hello, I'm Jordi Baylina. I'm the technical lead at Polygon zkVM, and I've been developing a lot of toolings in the zero knowledge, like Circom and Snark.js.
I'm Jon Wu, head of growth at Aztec. We're building an encrypted ZK rollup on Ethereum.
I'm Dawn. I'm a professor in computer science at UC Berkeley, and also the co-director of a new campus-wide center at Berkeley called Berkeley Center for Responsible Decentralized Intelligence, focused on blockchain Web3 decentralization technologies. And I'm also the founder at Oasis Labs.
Great, thank you for being here. So we want to start by just getting to a fundamental question, and then we'll jump in. Because so privacy is not a binary thing. We've heard other people talk about it, different kind of privacy leaks, metadata leaks, things like that, choices and consent that people have and what they choose to disclose or not disclose. So when you guys are designing products with privacy, because privacy is a key part of everything you guys are building, how do you think about how to go about building privacy into your products? What are the considerations?
I can start maybe, and the first thing is developers should have privacy in mind. I mean, this is quite obvious, but I don't think that many developers in the world have that in mind. I will put you some examples. When you are designing a program, in general, you tend to capture as much data as you can. Sometimes you don't even know why this data is going to happen, but you want to have it. And this is quite common, and you just don't care. You don't have privacy in mind. You don't know what happens if this data is leaked at some point or what's going to happen. So, I mean, the first thing is, okay, developers, when you are developing anything, please think that there is one thing named privacy, which is a right, and take that in account. And from there, we can start talking. But I think this is the first step.
I think there's also a recognition from consumers growing and growing of how important privacy is and that they're going to demand it in their products. And part of the challenge is that education piece of trying to communicate from the design side of this data is private or this data is not, and what that means to the user, and how do you kind of gently educate them if they don't already feel that privacy is important. And so little things in the wallet that can indicate this. In MobileCoin, there's like a private pay indicator for any transaction that is end-to-end encrypted. I think so that's on the design side that faces the user. And then on the system design side, going from when you're starting at, we want to design our entire system so that we don't have any data. If someone were to come subpoena us and ask for data, we could give them everything because we just don't have any data on our users. If that's your first design principle and then everything follows from that, I think that's very effective.
Yeah, at Aztec, we like to say that privacy needs to be built in the base layer. And one of our other sayings is that privacy is not EVM compatible. Back when Ethereum was created, we couldn't really build privacy into the base layer, and that's what we're working on for our next generation encrypted blockchain. And so we're using a UTXO model at base, and the idea is to be generalizable and programmable to the extent that you can put smart contracts into U2XOs and encrypt smart contract logic. And so We've seen historically in the past what happens when privacy is not the default and it's not available on the base layer. It can be censored, it can be shut down, and the privacy set and anonymity of users is really restricted.
So privacy by design, essentially we need to help educate developers to really think through the privacy architecture. As like the earlier panelists mentioned, so essentially the developer need to know essentially who has access and control of what data. And this needs to be built in from the beginning. And also at the same time, we need to provide the tooling for developers so that they can actually more easily achieve the privacy goals. So Ethereum has no privacy. So with Oasis, Oasis actually has just launched a privacy layer for Web3. So essentially provides this privacy compute functionality and capability to actually all different chains where the smart contracts on one chain, and if they want to use privacy compute capability, they can actually utilize this privacy layer to do privacy compute. So that's one example of complementing, for example, Ethereum and other chains that don't have privacy, but actually provides the capability for the application to have this additional capability to help protect a certain functionality and data and so on.
Yeah, I really appreciate that idea of educating developers. And Jordi had mentioned as well, right, is this kind of within the whole fabric of the company, or the project that you're working on, to be able to inculcate that as a core value. It was interesting. I heard, I think her title was, and I may be getting it wrong, was like the Chief Privacy Officer for Apple. And she had told me some privacy, or she was speaking to a group of us, but had told us about some of the privacy protections that they take internally, like for maps. They don't know if you're on Apple Maps who that person is that's doing that query to find that place. And that sounds nice as a PR bite. But I asked a senior engineer if that was true. And he said when they go through, they have been chartered within their groups when they do design, that they have to look at two things. They have to look at usability and they have to use at privacy. They're not looking at like what the market potential is, but if those two elements have to be there for any engineering work that's being done. So I hope that's true. But I think that's great advice for projects. So with that, then do you think companies that are building, whether they're privacy-preserving projects or not, kind of inherently, do you think developers have an obligation to users for protecting privacy? What do you think those obligations are?
I can kick this off of, I do think it's an obligation. And I think it's an obligation because privacy is a human right, that all developers need to think about what it means to build privacy into their products, just from the perspective of being a human who's delivering a product that's not going to exploit users. Because right now, the driving kind of business mechanism is if we can find pain medication, if we can solve the pain for our users, then they'll pay us money. And that is a little bit, it can lead to exploitation because the users need your product. And so if you can instead say from the beginning, we're going to solve your problem and we're going to do it in a way that protects your privacy, ultimately users will choose the things that protect them as well. And so I do think it's an obligation, even just in terms of long-term, your product being successful.
Yeah. The word obligation, I mean, from the legal perspective, of course, there are some rules, and yeah, probably you have some obligations to do things in the right way. But there is more the ethical obligation, and here is where it comes from. I think as a human beings, from the ethical perspective, we need to think about this right of privacy. So, yes, I would say that it's an obligation, but it's an ethical obligation. Is something that nobody is going to force you directly, but it's something that if you are honest with yourself and if you believe in this, you have to do it definitively.
This might be an unpopular view, but I actually do think we're obligated and have to actually take a very opinionated and even paternalistic view toward protecting user privacy. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that we're working on is a private voting proposal for Nouns DAO. And one of the big problems with private voting is that if people elect public voting, they can reduce the privacy anonymity set and thereby actually hurt the privacy of other users. So privacy is kind of this unique thing, especially if there's some interaction between public state and private state, which we all aim to build. It's this weird thing where it's a communal good. If everyone participates, it strengthens privacy, and if people defect, it weakens privacy. And so one of the ways that we can help protect user privacy is be really opinionated and actually reduce user choice to expose their own privacy and security. And of course, this is very hard to square with our libertarian principles of self-sufficiency and freedom and autonomy. But it's really hard otherwise to expect people to always perform exactly the actions they need to make sure that they're protected.
I think, yes, certainly we want to help educate developers to really take this privacy as human rights more seriously. But on the other hand, I think we want to take a practical view as well. Developers ultimately, so first they need to survive. They need to build a great app that's actually get users, get growth, and so on. So I think for us, we need to provide better tooling, better technologies to, one, make it easier for developers to build privacy-first applications. And two, we need to help them to view this privacy-first as an advantage for them, for their business. Because otherwise, so for example, earlier Apple actually complains that some of the people inside Apple complain that because of their privacy, they don't have enough data to, like other companies, to actually train models, and hence it's harder for them to get as performant models. As an example, so basically, because of certain restrictions due to the privacy protection, certain capabilities, certain functionalities is harder for the app to build. So that's why we understand a lot of developers, maybe they do, even though in the ideal world, they would like to make it privacy first, but they have a lot of other practical considerations. So I think for us, from the privacy technology perspective, we need to help them to somehow flip this around to, one is to make their life easier so that they can still do the things that they want to do by providing better technologies, and also somehow help them to show this as an advantage. For example, getting users to have better trust of the applications and so on. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. Instead of just saying that it's developers' obligations, they have to survive first.
Yeah, so there's trade-offs. There's trade-offs that everybody has to make as it relates to privacy and security, or privacy and usability, or maybe there is, maybe there isn't. So kind of maybe a hard question for some of you all. Like, what do you see as some of those trade-offs based on the tooling that we have available today? And within your projects, do you have any examples of where you've had to make some trade-offs as it relates to user experience and kind of perfect privacy or privacy protections?
I love this question because there's, in privacy primitives, there's a lot of overlap with blockchain primitives, which is just cryptography. And cryptography does not always present easy-to-use concepts. For example, we have 12 to 24 words that represent your secret key. And that is something that, as an industry, I think we're still struggling with a lot, is how do you onboard someone to cryptocurrency and say, now you're going to have these 12 words that you have to either memorize, which is what some people suggest, or put it into a safe or back it up in a password manager that might be it's a leap, right? It's not familiar. And then if you have to try to explain what are those 12 words, it's like you go down a rabbit hole. And so, however, that entropy, that seed phrase is so critical to every piece of blockchain and every piece of privacy that derives in that same environment. And so something that we're obsessed with is there a world in which we can remove those 24 words from the onboarding experience, from the user having to think about that? And there's this wonderful technology that Signal developed, Signal Messenger, that's open source, called Secure Value Recovery. I encourage everyone to check it out, where you're able to back up that 24 words in a way that is completely oblivious to the service operator, so they have no idea that you're even accessing those words, or like what your activity is around those words, and they can't take those words and they can't custody your funds. And this is something that I think, like Don was saying, we have to build these sorts of tools that are open source that the developers can then build on to make it across the whole industry. We're able to remove these barriers to entry around, honestly, just challenging UX.
Yeah, this I remember the first time that in blockchain, for some circumstances, I had to. I really got a lot of money in my accounts, and was money that was not mine. And okay, you realize at that point the importance of the privacy, and you need to learn something. Okay, maybe you know about cryptography, you know about things, but how you protect your things, how you make these things privacy, what are my risks, and you realize that I had no idea. But then you ask people around, and I mean, the industry, well, people had some ideas, but there were not clear solutions on how to do that. So I think that this shows the immaturity that we are in the space for relying on privacy. So what are the best practices for the users? What are the best practices for the applications? What are the best practices for protecting and then against, don't losing and these balances on that? This was, this was a learning. You realize that there is not a good solution. That's clearly a place where the industry needs to invest and to work on that. At this point, you discover the hardware wallets, but then you realize the risk of hardware wallets and what happened when you lose it, or you understand about the hacks of the hardware wallets itself. I mean, there is a lot of things, but I want here to just, I would like to ask here to the people is just to start thinking in this process in a more standardized way, so in a more best practices way, so that this can be exported not to the community but to the new people that's coming to the community and to the world in general.
And Aztec, one of the things that we believe is that your transactions have to be fully encrypted client-side before they leave your machine. Now, the problem there is there's a little bit of inbuilt latency because there's some client-side proof generation time that has to occur. That's a really distinct trade-off for blockchain systems if there's some client-side latency. And so I think a lot of the challenge that we're going to face in the next months and years is convincing developers to trade a different set of constraints for privacy. And it's going to be superior in a lot of ways. With zero-knowledge proofs, you're going to get arbitrary runtimes, and you're going to get you're going to have to lose the idea of gas, and that's a huge benefit. On the other hand, you're going to have to really think about proof generation time. And so I think the trade-off set here is just convincing developers that there's a whole new set of actions that they can take inside their applications, which is reading and writing to private state, accessing private compute, and that's worth this kind of different set of trade-offs from what you see in public blockchains.
And also, I think people need to really recognize the importance that privacy is a really complex topic. When we talk about privacy, it's actually as we know, for anything that you want to do that's interesting, sufficiently interesting, like compute over data and so on, you can't have absolute privacy. That simply doesn't exist. And hence, when you talk about trade-offs, really, you have to essentially understand the applications deeply and understand exactly what privacy actually means in this application. I mean, in blockchain today, most of the conversation in privacy today more focus on privacy in transactions and some of these simpler financial applications and so on. But when we look at the broader scope, the broader world, really people are talking about more sophisticated data, not just your transactions, but other types of more sophisticated data, and you need to compute over the data. And then in that area, privacy is a lot more complicated. And I think that's really where the application developers need to have a very good understanding of what the application does, and figure out what kind of privacy technology you can use to achieve what. So for example, we've done some work even in the space, like when you train machine learning models, these like large language models, for example, actually they remember sensitive information in the training data. So then even when the attacker doesn't know the model architecture and the model parameters, by just querying the model, they can extract information about the inputs from just querying the model. So this is just an example, like when we talk about privacy problem, it's actually so much broader, and it's actually really, really difficult and complicated. So that's why I think, so basically in the blockchain space, so far, I think a lot of the privacy discussion more focused on the transaction side, but as the blockchain space grows, as we see more different types of applications, richer applications, we need to help the developers to recognize the complexity of the domain.
Yeah, absolutely. So with some of that, in the way that we're thinking about some of these trade-offs and not having absolute privacy, there's this panel, Michelle mentioned it, that's coming up. So what is your opinion on user security and privacy? Are they the same thing, or are they different things?
I think I'm not actually sure what the consensus is on whether security and privacy have to be at odds or whether they kind of encompass each other. My feeling is that privacy kind of encompasses security, and that, for example, if you are going to a coffee shop and you're going to buy some coffee with the blockchain, and it's a fully transparent blockchain, then not only does the barista know everything about every transaction you've ever done, the people behind you know what you paid your therapist, but also someone who knows the address of the coffee shop now knows your real-time location if they're tracking you. And if you have a stalker, that's like bad news. And so I think that security and privacy kind of go hand in hand when we're talking about protecting the user and security for the user in many cases. And they can also be at odds in scenarios where you have someone who's being taken advantage of, and then if their funds disappear and there's no recourse to get them back, that can also be distressing. So I think there's a balance of how do we find the right transparency to protect the user, or opt in to give them the security around that, while also giving them the security that privacy supplies.
Yes, security is, I understand security as, protecting against something that can hurt you, okay? So, and definitively privacy is a tool, or is a way, or is a characteristic in order to get this security in for many things, That's what I would say between the two worlds.
Yeah, I think we're all here because we want individual freedom, and privacy is actually the prerequisite for all of our personal freedoms. And so to make that a little bit more tangible, right, what is security, or getting spearfished, but losing the freedom to your assets? And so you can't spearfish a fish you can't see. You can't front run a transaction you can't detect. Privacy and security are deeply interlinked, we believe. And so while they might be orthogonal, right, there are certainly things that privacy can't protect. If you, for instance, have a public-private key pair and you just decide to show somebody your private keys, we can't help protect you there. But everything on-chain being exposed is obviously a really bad place for us to be. And being able to limit the amount of targeting for users is a clear step forward with a value in the billions.
Yeah, I think both are important problems. Users certainly needs better security protection, right? For example, this key management and so on. It's very important for users to protect their assets and so on. And also, it's a broad problem. Like essentially every application has this type of issues. Whereas, so for example, every application, you need to help users, either it's in Web3, you protect your keys. In Web2, you protect your passwords and two-factor authentication and so on. I mean, these are just examples. But for privacy, I think, as I mentioned again, it's a much more complex problem, and oftentimes it's more application-specific. Right? So for example, key management for different applications, essentially you all need to solve similar key management problem. But for privacy, it's more, I would say oftentimes it's more application dependent. So, and hence it's actually more complex, more tricky, that you actually need to provide, the application developer needs more help and needs to think more carefully, specifically for the application, to do the privacy design and so on for the application.
Okay, thank you. How am I doing on time? I see I'm done. I can't see the thing, so I'm sorry. I am 2 minutes and 30 seconds over. I have so many more questions. Thank you for joining us. We'll go to the next panel. Sorry for overrunning. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it.